could even fund the Act to promote their farm-in-a-box retail empire. So that concludes my analysis of the parlour state of Ambridge Parish Council. I would just add that in preparing my paper, I found that parish councils appear to be very under-researched, and this seems to be a missed opportunity given the crucial role they're now expected to play in the political and civic infrastructure. So over to you, colleagues. Thank you.
Questions for Christine? No, I've got this one.
I have a problem with your recommendation of Anthea. My first encounter with parish council politics was in Nottinghamshire, I won't say where the then parish clerk was himself the major developer in the village. And it was only by dint of political campaign to get rid of him and get an impartial clerk that the democracy was able to prosper. So Anthea isn't a good mix, I don't think.
I can see where you're saying that. That must have been quite worrying. But I think the personality of Anthea is such that she would stand for no nonsense. I think she'd take this very seriously and act impartially. That's what I'd hope, anyway.
Thank you. How about Annabelle Scrivener? Get her off BL and get her as the parish clerk. Anyone? Yeah? No? Geraldine, yes, Geraldine. Kathy, she's got plenty of time on her hands.
Anyone but Jim, really?
Hi, I was curious about your figures to do with parish council, because I live in a community which has slightly less than 200 households, and we're informed that we're a parish meeting, not a parish council. And I think we could choose to be a parish council, so presumably Ambridge has done so. Yeah. But the other thing is, I discovered that the clerk to the parish council wasn't impartial, and I needed to make a formal complaint about that person, but there was no system with which to do so. I was told that it was just tough, and we just needed to vote him out.
But that should be, via the district council. But you see, I think this is better, a rich theme with more parish council politics in Ambridge. I think they skimmed the surface, really. In fact, I think they could do an entire, Christmas episode of an hour and a half, which would just be the council meeting. I think it would be fascinating.
Hi, how do you think Ambridge Parish Council is dealing with GDPR and how
I believe Jim has a pile of papers this high, with his piano music and Alistair's veterinary bills and that kind of thing. I suspect it's rather remiss. Yeah.
So we have a rich vein of form of interest in spatial planning, where, so if you're watching at the moment in Australia, Claire Astbury, hello, I know she'll want me to ask, why is there no Ambridge neighbourhood plan?
This is an excellent question, and I was going to mention that. They don't seem to have got their act together with a neighbourhood plan, and they're running out of time because the rules change quite soon, the planning framework's changing again. They've missed out on that. They've also missed out on an emergency plan, which is something that I was partly responsible for in our parish. And particularly in light of the flood, you'd think they'd be all over a very detailed emergency plan, but they don't seem to have one of those either, really. And it's Jim, as clerk, who's responsible really for kind of galvanising that and getting the councillors to do it, but it doesn't seem to be his thing.
I live in Wales, and years ago, I was a community council clerk. They don't call it parish there. No, I recognise none of those things. Legal advice and all that. They didn't seem to expect me to do anything like that. Should they have it well? I should have felt.
Is the community still there, or is it under a dump?
I'm not sure how it works in Wales. I think it's a genuine issue, though, that clerks have been expected to become more professional. They're employed, they're county council employees, but they're not necessarily given the resources and the budgets and the training to be up to speed with everything that the local property developers are doing, or the businesses are doing, or polluters are doing.
I certainly was not an employee.
No.
You weren't an employee, no.
There was somebody, but
I just wanted to say, I think that I really like to talk because in Northumbria, the parish councils are really quite powerful. Like my parish council has built affordable housing through a separate community interest trust. It runs the nursery, it runs lots of stuff. And I have a feeling that the scriptwriters are still on the older model without realising some of the stuff that parish councils can now do. I mean, everything in the village is run by the parish council.
Yeah, very good.
I think that's right, yeah.
Hello. I'm sorry, in Defence of Wales, I'm the Welsh Community Councillor. Because we don't have parish councils, we have community councils. And there's an umbrella organisation called One Voice Wales, which provides a huge amount of support. And it's the lack of absence of a county councillor I find strange, because every community council I've been involved with, half the meetings taken up with the county councillor's report, and the community council work with the county council far closely than Ambridge ever does.
I think
And
that,
particularly on planning issues,
yeah.
and something like the new development for housing is that would be classed as a major development and be called in.
Yes,
So
I know. I wonder if that's because the county councillor is a party political position and perhaps they're a bit concerned about getting too close
not
to
in
that.
Pembrokeshire.
Not in Pembrokeshire, okay. One thing I would say though is that in response to an earlier question, the paper I quoted, Willett and Cruxon from Exeter University, they did a lot of research at the Cornwall show asking people what they thought about parish councillors, and a lot of people said they got their impression of parish councillors from the archers.
God! Wowzers. Back.
Really enjoyed that, Christine. Thank you. And I particularly like the idea of the youth forum.
Yes.
But I think we might have to wait a little while for Molly Button, because when I was in Louisiana 2 weeks ago, I heard on the radio station over there that she's actually involved in the ballet company at Baton Rouge at the moment.
Well, Molly gets about, but she could do it remotely, you know, it's online.
That's
I'm sure
very
she could,
true.
you know.
So we should explain that in the Button sisters, it is accepted by us all that they are radical feminist activists. So forthcoming Headlam 2020 paper on moon cups in the village shop is about the Buttons. Now they did vandalise Rob's car, but I have just created an entire backstory for them as proper riot girls, proper rad femme. So, you know.
Bunting thieves.
What?
Bunting thieves.
Oh! Bunting thieves, indeed.
Whilst we're on the subject of village meetings, there never seems to be a parochial church council meeting either.
That's Neil as well, isn't it?
That's true, and that would be Neil as well, or Alan would probably convene that. Obviously, they're two quite separate organisations. But the parish council is supposed to have an annual parish meeting, quite separate from its monthly meetings or however. And they don't seem to have one of those either, which is, again, a sort of, in a crisis they do, but they don't have a kind of a get-together.
So there might be a connection there for Olivia, actually, if the parish council were able to instance your kind of PR reboot around these issues, we could really be getting somewhere. Absolutely. Right, what time are we on? Oh, no. Yep. Hang on, I'll give you this one.
Sorry, I'm just standing at the front now.
Never apologise for yourself. You're standing at the front.
Yeah. My question would be about the youth having a subsidiary youth team. How would you galvanise and motivate that? Because my understanding is from being from Suffolk, where they try to do that, is that it happened for a bit and then ultimately just kind of faded away.
I don't know. Well, suggestions welcome. I was thinking free pop and crisps and things like that.
Free pot! So Freddie Podger providing the Snacks.
No, I think genuinely giving them a platform, giving them something to do, giving them making the chance to make a difference, that they're not just there to chat, they can actually do things. I mean, I think some councils actually have done this. They have got their young people along to help them set up their website or their Facebook page or Twitter account or whichever. I think there would have to be a few constraints if Ambridge Youth did it, but that's the case. That's what's been shown throughout. Very few people do come forward. And it is a bit of a problem when the government is kind of relying on these local bodies to kind of do all their work for them, which is what's happening. So,
Christine, that was amazing.
thank you very much.
Archers Voice, everybody. The Ambridge Observer. Just like when I met Carol Boyd last night and curtsied. Right, so we've got 10 minutes. You can talk about things that were in those presentations, or just, speak freely about the issues of the day. Anybody? Anything to say? Silent, very good. Aha. Let's get started.
I'd be interested to know other people's take on Jim's recent outburst.
Oh, yes! So, Michelle, where are you? So Michelle, can you stand up, Michelle? Wave. So Michelle is a conversation starter in our Facebook group and had a strong opinion on this at the time. In fact, you can speak for yourself, Michelle.
I don't know what to say, actually. I just thought it was very harsh. And then I started to think about what his real motivation might be, which has nothing to do with Sheila's religious faith and everything to do with his son and feeling that he has to support his son. And it made me think about how when couples separate and get divorced, how the parties retreat into their various corners in the boxing ring, and the family has to take sides between one party and another. But yeah, I thought it was quite brutal.
So there was an active discussion on the Facebook group. If you're not on the Facebook group, what are you doing with your life?
We have a life, that's why.
Okay, so, vote. If you haven't heard Thursday again, what are you doing with your life?
Spoilers!
Not once it's broadcast, it's not a spoiler. That's the law. So, hands up if you thought Jim was out of order and overly harsh. Hands up if you thought Kerry Davis had been waiting for 20 years to write that scene. I think it's been there. It's been seeded all the way along for so long, and it's like the thing is, people are always really objectionable at the start. Jimus is kind of, he's one of our favourites because you need a bit of grit in the oyster of Ambridge, and he is sometimes really grumpy. Yeah, I think he's been waiting to say that to Sheila.
Yeah. And it was great to hear Alistair when she said, "Oh, do you think Ambridge?" He's like, "Well, and finally, I also have that
I don't think I'm the worst kind of hypocrite." That's what I wrote in the group. I was like, you do not get to break that man's heart, break your marriage vows, and then slide up to him for reassurance. Right. I thought, yeah. But we're a broad church. It was interesting because we did say that because it was a Kerry week this week, and because we were all getting together, we were really excited about it. It was really meaty and juicy. And I think, he's been waiting to write that. Could have been an hour-long special.
I don't think she's the worst kind of hypocrite.
There's a question behind.
I don't want to preempt my talk, but an awful lot of LGBT Christians are told exactly the same.
Really? Hypocrite.
How can you can't be gay and a Christian, how dare you?
Whoa.
But that, 11:45.
Let's have a heated debate. Can I just get a show of hands for the hookers and stickers of Ambridge that are here? i.e. crocheters and knitters. The Ambridge hookers and stickers, very good. More Ambridge hookers and stickers than parish councillors. But if you're not aware of this, you should have bought your wool, basically. Jez will organise the later, so they were there. Oh, very good. Right, any more views? Here we go again. Wales. Come in Wales.
Not relevant. You keep saying the Facebook group.
Yes.
Other groups are available.
Other groups.
No, I wasn't aware of any other Facebook groups. No.
So, Academic Artists has a Facebook group.
Sorry, I thought you were talking about another.
We're not the sweary one, weirdly. We're not the...
I am.
So, there's 1,800 of us, and we do have this sort of tradition that we stick to the themes that come up in the arches. We get very, very, very intense about them, but it's not sort of digression place. But yeah, it is fine. Academic arches, you have to answer 3 questions to get in. Of course, it won't be hard for anybody. There are, of course, other groups, and we applaud what they do, but, you know, we are best. Anybody else?
If not, we can just wait.
Oh, right at the back, Catherine.
Oh, Elizabeth, here.
I just wanted to say about Sheila. I agree with you, but I also don't think that, I think people see her as a hypocrite because she made a promise and she's always held herself out as this very honest and sincere particular type of Christian. And she went back on a promise she'd explicitly made, as opposed to just generally going against a separate Christianity. I don't know, I just find it very satisfying because she sees herself as a victim.
I mean, could she be more annoying? Is the question. I mean, she's just, yeah, we'll discuss. I'm glad you agree with me. If you say I agree with you first, you can definitely have longer. Oh yeah.
Hi. She does set herself up to be, holier than thou, but it's not just that she's divorced Alistair, she also, as many of us will remember, shagged Richard Locke when he was in Lucia. So I think...
you tried to go back there.
Exactly. So I think she has a long history of hypocrisy, really.
Slut shaming. That's slut shaming.
Yes, Michelle said you were slut shaming. Suggest that you think this should was a slut. So we'll move on quickly from that.
Yeah, I was just going to agree that for writing this week about the whole religion thing, it was really well done. Because actually he covered a really broad range of how people feel about church things, perhaps particularly, but with the christening as well as vows and everything like that. Really well done, lots of different points of view.
So this week, it was a Kerry week, so we have to assume it's having some kind of, crisis of faith or something, because it all came out. We'll put that on Twitter, he'll love that.
Sorry, back onto Sheila. What about Sheila and the new vet?
Well, that's assuming that her next love interest would be nails. Is that something in the offing, perhaps, potentially? I really like the new vet. I like the fact that he has completely bewildered everybody. The fact that he won't divulge everything about himself within the first 5 minutes of meeting. And he's actually able to do his job. I mean, he's wonderful. He's like my new Charlie Thomas. It's fantastic.
It's the only people are alike. Well, exactly. I mean, in Ambridge you stand out for showing up and trying to work.
I have a long hatred of Sheila. I go back to hunting on the gold, shagging the journalist in a cornfield, getting lost in Thailand. She is a pain in the neck, and she's been helped by her family and by her sex appeal. The only good she ever did was to help Nigel sell a swimming pool by posing in a bikini after she'd been on a strict diet. I rest my case.
If anybody from Colin Hackman would like to make the broader case that the Archer family are bloody awful, it would
club.
So, are you just running out? Is it a feature in this conference that the room is divided into two time zones?
2 time zones. Oh yes, that's right. That's for the delay in case I swear, and that's live.
I actually use the archers for enjoying hating people.
Yeah.
So it's like, in particular, Shula and Elizabeth. But I think it serves a sort of psychological purpose for me because it's safe to hate them. You know, I don't have to hate anyone in real life because I can just hate Shula for being a sanctimonious cow.
I've been taught called my BDSM relationship with the Archers, and it's all about the pleasure I get from the character's pain, and it's just wonderful.
If the Archers didn't exist.
Can I please just add to Shula's rap sheet a charge of racism? Do we all remember how shabbily she treated Usha not long after Usha was a victim of a racist hate crime? And just because Shula married the flaming vicar, you know, the racism...
No, Usha married the vicar.
Oh, sorry. No, yeah, Usha, of course, was setting in dementia. Also, I have given up alcohol for Lent, and I was very concerned that coming here for my first time, people might think I was Shula-esque. Absolutely not.
No, darling, you don't.
She's a bit...
There's a question, right at the back there.
Right at the back. Another newbie.
Hello. Is anybody else beginning to feel nervous what's going to happen to Emma and Ed? As they're getting back on their feet.
Olivia is. Yeah. Okay, so question to the audience. What is Tim kind of... Is Tim a baddie? And what kind of baddie? I think far right. Criminal? Far right criminal?
Oh, drug dealer, who said that? Yes, drug dealer, yes. Yeah. Who's ever else?
County lines, drug dealer. Modern day slavery? Alright, I'm down for all of it. Oh, leave them alone. Don't hurt Ed and Emma. Ed Bundy is the king of Ambridge.
I think he may be trying to get his hands on Peppa Pig.
The only asset that family has.
Right, let's have coffee. What time are we? Oh, no.
Right, change of topic here. Something that worries me greatly. What is going to be done about the homicidal tendencies of Hilda Ogden? You nearly killed Auntie Chris. Who's the next one? And interesting to think about it.
No, listen to that. Hilda Ogden isn't real. Hilda Ogden is a figment of Kate's imagination. She's Kate's familiar. I mean, yeah, no, that's married to me. Right.
It's time for coffee.
One more?
Right, okay, one more and then we're going to break for coffee.
Oh, Miss Ashley, yes, good point. Don't worry, Jay is young. No, Jay is young.
Hilda Ogden might kill Peggy if you want to look on the bright side.
Taking their time though.
Believe me, the intense dynastic politics around that pot of money.
Right, one question on Natasha then, and
Right,
let's
yeah.
go for coffee.
Okay, so Natasha.
Oh yes, sorry, yeah.
Very good. Natasha Archer. Nasha. Is she just a bit of a silly cow, or is that going to be dreadful as well? Someone husbands and running away from the debt collectors. What do you think?
Silly. It's just silly.
I didn't think a credit card bills were that
No. Okay.
I need to say something.
Owing up to 20,000, so what? Show of hands.
Oh my gosh.
I have to say that when Tom was so mad about like £8 grand's worth of credit card debt, and I was like, isn't that just normal everyday life if you've been to university and then didn't get a proper job for a bit afterwards?
Yeah.
I think she's silly. Yeah, oh my God, patronising. I'd have gone back to my mum's in Wales straight away.
Yeah.
Never mind the next day.
Yeah, I don't think she can go back anywhere. That's the point, right?
No,
I don't think
but he is not in a position to be criticising other people about how to run any kind of business.
Yeah, and we'll speak more about British father later. Right. Yeah, not coffee. Next session.
Yeah, thanks for the clear conversation.
So, session 2, and then we will have a break. Hot Fuzz, crime and the causes of crime. Fantastic. Thank you. Hi there, can you hear? Oh, mic. So, before I start, and I apologise for mangling the lyrics of not one but 2 Johnny Cash songs, could I just have a little show of hands of who's heard Friday night's episode? Okay, so all I'm having to say is I wrote this before Tim. Oh yeah. So last year I talked about Ambridge's offending population, and as a consequence of asking a friend of mine who's quite a senior police officer, I kept saying to her, can you tell me about your rural policing plan? And in the end she got so fed up with me doing that she told me to go and talk to her colleagues about their rural policing. And some of the things that I'm going to talk about today are based on those conversations and those activities that I did. So it's about rural crime in their areas and the challenges of rural police that rural police face locally, nationally and internationally. So I have to say that I did do this with trepidation. I'm a member of the British Society of Criminology, and we have a professional code of ethics, and that code of ethics says that I'm not allowed to publicly represent myself as an expert on something that I'm not. So I'm an expert on prisons and probation, and if Freddie'd been put inside a little bit earlier, I would have been talking about something different indeed. But, you know, I'm not an expert on rural crime. I'm an expert on the policing of a very tiny rural population. But it's a tiny rural population that hasn't consented to take part in any of my research. So if Hannah likes to get wound up about the ethics of what's going on the parish council, then I think that she's probably coming for me next, or she's coming for me next after Natasha. So we have this idea about rural policing being tinged with nostalgia. It's imbued with the fairy tales of golden age of policing along with a rustic ideal. And I'm going to be a little nostalgic here. I'm going to think about this, last year when I talked about crime, and I talked about crime not being out of control in Ambridge. How wrong was I? So I suggested last year that the crimes of the middle classes of Ambridge were always treated as being only a flapjack. And it seemed as though that might have been a red rag to the scriptwriters. The red rag to people in Ambridge. And Brian has not been locked up. Freddie has. Ben and Rory seem to be getting away with joyriding, and Josh thinks that it's okay to defraud insurance companies. And really, thank goodness for Eddie's moral compass on that. And that's really not something that you hear every day. So this leads me to question Is Harrison the least interesting thing about Ambridge's crime and its management? The only thing interesting about Harrison is Fallon, quite frankly. But it also asks me to question, why won't the police let me talk to them about Ambridge, Aidensfield or Loch Dew? There we are. So in the last 5 years, the National Rural Crime Network has started its work. It's a collective of police and is supported by 30 police and crime commissioners who drive the objectives for their associated police constabularies. Now, while the network aims to help people feel and be safe, and to demonstrate that there's an understanding of the needs and worries of people living in rural communities, it still relies on the operational priorities of each constabulary to decide where to put resources. So, while at the Rural Affairs Summit last year, which I went to with the Rural Crime Network and lots of coppers, my God, I have to say that is the best day of my career. I got put in a 4x4, a police 4x4, driven down the A1 at speed with a police, oh gosh, what are they called? Quad bike on the back of this 4x4. I got to talk to the Sheep Association, who curiously were uninterested in my concerns about rare breeds and knitting, but you know, that's entirely other matter. So during that session, I asked a rural crime lead from one of the larger constabularies just why it was that PC Burns was both the dedicated officer for Ambridge, but also policing nightclubs in Borchester. And I have to say, this man, who was standing behind me in the lunch queue, without missing a beat, said, "Wow, that's pretty perceptive of you. I think that it just shows that Borchester's constabulary resources are just as stretched as ours are." And we just had this lovely conversation. So, strategic officers have to make a decision about how many operational officers to deploy in geographically large but sparsely populated areas. In some rural areas, if you look at the number of police per head of population, they're actually over-resourced. So my colleague from Northumberland may be surprised by that. Well, I can't see where she is, yes. But understandably, the perceptions are quite different. Now, while 30 constabularies support the work of the National Rural Crime Network with staffing and dedicated officers to look at wildlife crime, sheep worrying, livestock crime, only 11 constabularies have paid to have their data analysed in the Rural Crime Survey of last year. Of the 20,000 people who took part in this survey, we know how many people from West Mercia, Warwickshire, Gloucestershire filled in the crime survey, but we know nothing more than that. We don't know those victims' concerns or fears or frustrations. And survey respondents were asked where the criminal incident they were a victim of took place. And I can only assume that people in Borchester and Borsetshire said, "I don't know." This table, which you really can't see very well, but if you have a look at the crime survey, you can see all of this data in its glory. So it sets out the occurrences of crimes that specific rural businesses, so farmers, landowners, rural vets, experienced between 2017 and 2018. And if I highlight just a few, we've got 18% who've had fly tipping on their land, 14% who've experienced hair coursing on their land, 11% have had agricultural machinery stolen. And then we've got further down 5% who've experienced sheep worrying and 4% have had theft of fuel. Now, I think that we've probably heard mention of fly tipping, and Josh clearly has had machinery stolen, but Harrison doesn't seem to have mentioned any of these other crimes. He doesn't seem to have picked up on this. So is it the case that Harrison isn't trustworthy, that people don't report crimes to him, or is it that Borsetshires, that's difficult for me to say this morning, PCC doesn't care about rural crime and the impact of crimes on their rural communities? Quite frankly, they're missing a beat there. So, to be fair, there aren't many PCCs who have rural crime and policing as an objective in their plans. Sometimes you can count on the fingers of one hand the mentions of rural crime in PCC plans, and I've read a few. It's what's also concerning me is that it's almost impossible to get hold of the Borsetshire Police and Crime Plan, and this is a real worry. They should be open, accountable, work along the Nolan principles, but it's not there online. I can't understand why. But we can see the ones of West Mercia and the ones of Gloucestershire. So West Mercia are talking about reassuring rural communities, and Gloucestershire are talking about accessibility and accountability, so they're talking about visible rural policing, and they're talking also about safer driving and reducing drink driving, and all of those are the concerns to the local areas in Gloucestershire. So if rural concerns are hardly mentioned in policing plans, is it any wonder that almost 3/4 of rural businesses who've been victims of crime feel frustrated, angry or disgusted with the way that they've been treated by the police? Police in rural areas walk this fine line between trying to manage all the competing demands on their time and resources, often in areas where other services are being cut. Okay, so one of the colleagues talked to me, one of the police officers said, I need the farmers on side to report things, but how do I support their wives who might be stuck in the farmhouse in the middle of nowhere with no access to any service provision? I thought, okay, this is a good chance. I'm going to talk about the Archers again, about intimate partner violence and policing, and I was met with a roll of the eyes and then a moving on. So police in rural areas deal with similar crimes to those in urban settings, but with a less frequency of them happening. Policing rural communities need to have a special set of social skills. They need to take part in monthly stops, have cups of tea, but they also need to take part in community and parish meetings where policing, crime and disorder is talked about. And again, I don't hear Harrison doing this. I only hear Harrison talking to elderly ladies when he's trying to butter them up so he can buy their house. So who is doing policing in rural communities? Susan, according to Susan last month, it's her. So in Ambridge, just as in Gloucestershire, there are concerns about driving safety. The Parish Council, although I'm still not convinced it was the Parish Council, as is its right and requirement, talked about crime and disorder and had the speeding initiative. But again, I can't remember, and I'm Harrison being involved in that, and I'm happy to be disabused of that fact. As a local officer, it's his role to take part in community policing initiatives. And I've not heard of him taking part in any community policing meetings. And I'm really wondering what the rural policing arrangements in Borsetshire actually are. Police in other constabularies involve volunteers, gamekeepers, estate managers, people from wildlife organisations to take part in night operations where they patrol sections of the countryside, looking out for the things that might be suspicious or problematic or criminal. And I had the great pleasure of being involved in one of these. I went along to one of the sessions. We had a lovely briefing from the Chief Constable, who said on 3 occasions that it wasn't just a coincidence that he was there talking about rural crime. It wasn't just lip service. He said that 3 times in 15 minutes. So, but I was paired with an estate manager. So we went out to his 4x4. I opened the car door, moved his shepherd's crook, not a euphemism. I clambered into the 4x4. He turned the engine on. The radio blared. And ladies and gentlemen, it was 7 And he looked really embarrassed, and I thought it was delightful. So we drove around, we talked about crime, we talked about nuisance, we talked about the things that are being committed, and we talked about the fact that he thought that, a lot of this crime was being done by people from outside the community. But I imagine, with the wave of young people that are about to come from downtown Felpersham that Kate's going to work with, there's going to be a perception in Ambridge that the crime rate and levels of nuisance are going to spike. So I'm expecting, just as Kenton, Roy and Jazza speculated this week, that Derek Fletcher is going to have a lot to say about this, and he's going to say it very loudly. I'm also concerned about Derek Fletcher being a proponent of hate crime, but I'll come back to that at another occasion. So it's clear that some rural communities and some rural crimes are committed by people in their community. As one of the coppers said to me, do you know what? It takes a lot of skill to round up 200 sheep in the dark. Right, so who should Harrison be looking for next? We know that many rural crimes can be linked back to organised crime. You start local and you get a bigger picture. Going onto a property to poach means that you can identify whether there are larger pieces of agricultural machinery and that can be stolen and shipped out of the country to order. Okay, this is what happens. So Adam might be regretting his vote in a recent referendum if his machinery does get nicked and the policing is not there, cross-border policing isn't there to get his things back. So my question is, if all of these things are linked to organised crime, who is it that Harrison should be looking for next? Tim? Well, yes. Before last night, I wouldn't have said Tim, but Tim. Anybody else? I'm suggesting Josh. Josh has got that second-hand agricultural business machinery thing going on. Anyway, or perhaps it's Leonard. And I love Leonard. He's marvellous. So. Leonard, and the reason I say Leonard wondered whether Freddie might be able to cope with a large family gathering so soon after his release. And we know from the gossip in the kitchen at Brookfield that Leonard also, quotes, looked appalled when Ben pushed Freddie about what it was like to be inside. So this leads me to wonder whether Leonard has done a stretch himself. Oh yeah. And whether Leonard knows about the niceties of not asking other people about what they've done and what it's like inside. Or, quite simply, whether, as part of his training for being a volunteer at the Laurels, he's had a course on the hidden impact of imprisonment on family members. So it's either one or the other. So lastly, since his appraisal back at the end of last year, Harrison's been studying hard for his sergeant's exams, which he took along with all the other coppers in the country in the middle of March. And we know that's true because it was talked about in the book. If he's passed, then he's going to have to wait to see where he's going to be deployed. And he might continue to be a rural officer. But to be truthful, I'm concerned that Harrison hasn't been as effective as he might be. I'm also a bit concerned that I'm agreeing with Will, that Will has had the right to question Harrison's professional integrity. Has Harrison reached the College of Policing's 9th professional standard of behaviour relating to his conduct on or off duty? He should not bring discredit to the police service or undermine public confidence in policing. And all I'm saying is lying to the cricket team. In order for it even to be suggested that Harrison was in a position to study for his sergeant's exams, he will have to have demonstrated his competence in previous work. So to end, I'm just going to ask you the question about how good a copper Harrison is, and I'm going to leave that question hanging in the breeze, unlike the village fete paraphernalia.
So we do have our esteemed colleagues from Borsetshire Police here today. As I say, we'll be policing the Academic Archers Conference in Sheffield this week. In case of any disorder arrests, please supply us a record of your past crimes to ease processing. And then go, actually, we've got one eye on you, one eye on the pastries. Any questions for Charlotte?
Can I ask what's your assessment of PC Burton's investigation into Matt Crawford and being run over?
All I can say is poor. You know, he didn't. I would suggest that he passed everything on, and he didn't do his job properly. He should be there to be sort of being the eyes and ears. And I'm entirely unconvinced that Harrison is doing anything other than being fed up by Fallon, and pieces of cake.
Very hazy recollection of Harrison doing some sort of crime prevention sort of discussions in the Bull once, and I think it was more part of his strategy of getting to know Farrell. And
Again.
Also that he went to see, I think it was Jill when she was living alone in a cottage about some sort of break-in. Can anyone else remember that? Because sort of very hazy, not a recollection.
So he went round and did do his crime prevention work, yeah. So, but you know, as a rural copper, he should be holding regular meetings, quarterly meetings, along with the help of the parish council. So, you know, if the parish council are not as well developed as they might be, perhaps that goes hand in hand. But we rarely hear it. He should be going around having a little chat, having cups of coffee, and he's just, and lemon drizzle cake, and he's just not doing that.
Oh, it is on, I think. It's on. Oh,
No, the batteries run out. Oh no, it's on. It's
Yeah.
on now.
There we are.
sorry, it's me. Sorry. So just,
But what you're saying is that's happened in a lot of rural areas.
We
could, if you see a police car driving over Granny Buller, you have a netty.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely.
Police are based down to Clapton. It could take them 2 days to respond to anything when they just give you a number.
Yeah.
So there's no police presence.
And that's.
You can see more on traffic offences. At least they don't have all these pickups so they can raise the speed limit so it doesn't get done. But there's not one live crime officer. They just grab all the traffic.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. In large geographical areas, and in my, I think that Borsetshire is probably smaller than Warwickshire, smaller than Gloucestershire. So certainly not large like West Mercia, which is an enormous area. If you look at the number of police that should be in those areas, by head of population, they are over-policed. And I absolutely understand. I don't know why I'm trying to defend the Borsetshire police here. I absolutely understand why the perception isn't there. But it's the phrase that has been used in rural policing work is fitting a 12-foot carpet to a 15-foot room. and they're trying to do that as well. Harrison's just a bit wet, quite frankly.
Can I just add, coming from rural Northumberland, like the young lady here, not a lot happens apart from between 7:03 and 7:15. We fondly remember the days 10 years ago when Northumbria police were overwhelmed by our escaped killer in the local village, Round Wood, the Geordie lad with the shotgun, not a nice chap. But it was so exciting. I was living with my ex-boyfriend then down the hill, who farms a mile away from me, and we were asked to search our outbuildings, and on my way to work to the university every day, I was stopped by 3 roadblocks with armed policemen. We were overwhelmed. We had the PSNI, the RUC as they then were, the Met, the Flying Squad. They were all there. And they did it. It took them over a week to find him. He was actually spotted in the local village going to the chippy. And the policemen spent most of the time in the local butchers going through the pie menu. We did a roaring trade.
It wasn't, I have to say, it wasn't just the residents. My colleagues were involved, and they were, it's an academic community. No, hang on. My colleagues were involved. They're academics. They're experts on policing. And one of my colleagues spent the week with Sky News talking about it. And he's also a very big Archers fan. But of course, it is massively exciting, and that those things don't happen very often.
Yeah, no. But just in Harrison's defence, I think he may have missed his vacation.
Oh.
Natasha could do with a session with him. He's missed his vacation as a financial advisor.
Oh,
we all remember he set up a pension for planners. So,
Very good.
Sorry, I just have a question. In terms of...
Stop apologising.
There you go.
I'm British. So, do you think that in the world of social media, the world will be for or against Mr. Burns? Because the reason I bring it up, a few weeks ago I was doing a lobby day in front of Parliament, and there was 2 different protests going on. There was against some sort of loan and pro-Brexit thing. And this police van just started reversing into me. I was standing at the Winston Churchill statues behind me, and my colleague got very scared and said, "What have you done?" And I thought, "Nothing, I'm just standing here." And these armed police came out, massive, very large guns. And the man came over to me and he said, "Oh, what are you up to today?" And I said, "I didn't do anything wrong." and he went, "I get that a lot." And, so, as part of their community outreach, they literally just come to these marches and talk to people just to make them less scared of the police. And so I said, "Can I have a picture with you?" And then this woman came up and tried to take a picture.
And you're now dating.
He was a very large man, very broad. They were chatting to these other protesters, which was the pro-Brexit one. I think one of them was holding a sign saying, "Honk if you want to leave," or something like that. And someone took a picture with them. And when I went home that night, I put my picture on the internet and I tagged it as, I put it on Instagram, tagged it as, Parliament Square or whatever, and realised that that picture was on the internet and someone had written underneath, "These people were just trying to protest," and the police came and broke it up. But they were not. They chatted to me, they chatted to everyone around me, they were asking about what I work for, the people in front of me they took a picture of, they were talking about cakes. Everyone loves cake.
There's some really interesting discussions about how the police, including Dorsetshire, use social media, and I'm happy to talk to you about that in the break.
Yeah, very good.
One more question.
Yeah, come on.
Well, I'm from rural Lancashire as well, and I can just comment that Borsetshire is obviously a more peaceful place than Lancashire, because we were at the village annual parish council annual meeting, which does take place in our village. The representative from the police who was there was asked about these teams of volunteers doing speed gun surveys, as we've heard happening in Ambridge. They take place in Cumbria, which is half a mile away from our village. In Lancashire, they're not allowed to take place unless there's a police officer with the volunteers in case of violence. So the Borsetshire police are obviously confident there will not be a threat of violence to volunteers.
Well, I think that probably they're not going to put Jim and Shula together on speed camera. It reminds me, thank you, Charlotte. Growing up in a tiny village on Exmoor, the most efficient way for my local policeman to police was to also be the barman in the local pub. So he could see all of us doing our underage drinking under his watchful eye, but also know whose keys to take off at the end of the night when they were too drunk to go home. Last word from Borsetshire Police. Look, as long as he doesn't bring AC-12 crashing down on our heads, we really don't care what he does or doesn't get up to. Can you imagine what a beautiful mashup that would be? So, we should have called him Damien. This could be about nearly any one of the young men in Ambridge at the moment.
Test for levels. Hello. Loud enough.
We should have called him Damien. Everybody hear me?
Thanks, Mum. Let's go again.
We should have called him Damien. So, we should have called him Damien. A discussion of the impact of Henry Archer's early years on potential crimes of the future. Do I need to take this one off now? Yeah. Hello?
Hello.
Is it as you click it? Okay.
Yeah, you click it and just sort of hold it.
Hello.
Just
Hello.
hello. Fix the light up. Keep holding the red.
It's alright, I can go and sit down again, I don't mind.
No, you are, mate. Off.
It just does take 10 seconds to
Hello?
Thank you. So just keep it right there, because you're quite soft.
Okay, let's start again. We should have called him Damien. Discussion of the impact of Henry Archer's early years on potential crimes of the future. I'm no expert on this, but I've just thought it'd be fun to see the pros and cons, what evidence there is about him. Just to say, the background photographs are all by my sister, who's currently doing a project on domestic violence through photography called An Unkindness of Ravens. So, the facts. In my mind, these are the facts we need to consider. He was 5 when he potentially witnessed the stabbing and was then deprived of his mum for about 5 months. He saw coercive controlling action and was bullied by his stepfather. Then Rob left. Gideon, my son, was very nearly taken, and poor Henry wasn't part of the deal. Traditional attachment theory says that a child that doesn't have a beneficial bond with their mother may become an offender. Henry was denied his mum for a time, and he was then deprived of Rob. Nobody talked about him. Nobody said where he'd gone. Poor Henry. This could create affectionless psychopathy. So he might not be able to display affection, might act on impulse and not have regard for his own behaviour. More recent research states that if the initial bonds are good, it doesn't really matter whether it's mum, dad or granny. But probably best not Tom, that the attachment happens with. Rob bullied Henry. We all heard the, "Okay, Daddy, I'm sorry, Daddy," as Rob ordered Henry about. Rob was a bully when teaching Henry to play cricket, and he was transmitting his values to Henry. What will tip the balance? Will the experiences with Rob and the tinned custard change Henry forever? There we go. Much as of the research states that it's the first relationship that is important. Okay, so much of a child's future well-being is established with this bond, and researchers assert that separation alone does not play as important a role in emotional development as previously thought. Ainsworth had this theory of maternal deprivation, and that's our starting point for looking at Henry. There was no lack of maternal care. Obviously, it was a dramatic birth. They are all dramatic in Soapland. But this didn't seem to affect Henry. Maternal care was not distorted, as Helen didn't neglect her little devil. However, discontinuity may have been an issue, although Henry's very close and loving relationship with his grandparents, with Tom, and other members of the huge extended family allowed him to maintain equilibrium when Helen was banged up. Helen's very close bond in the early years with Henry will also support his stability. Although we've got to consider Helen's previous mental ill health, her anorexia. That could be a symptom of unresolved issues from her childhood. When you look at the issue of separation, the critical period appears to be about 2.5 years old. And that, to my mind, was around the time, 2.5, 3 years old, when Rob appeared on the scene. He was being quite normal then. Then he got a little bit creepy, but we had Helen, Pam, and Tony all being consistent in their care. Attachments are affected by the degree to which the parent is sensitive to the needs of the child. Now, whilst Rob was a bit dodgy in that area, this could be interpreted as the steadiness or boringness of Pat and Tony. So they do have a use in their boringness. So that could have been a beneficial effect. Much of the literature gives us lots of things with one hand, with visions of Henry coming to mind, bloody knife in hand, only to be dashed with the wholesome effect of Pat and Tony on the other. So we know that Henry's needs were likely to have been met as an infant. He wasn't left to cry. Was Clive Horrobin? And then there's a research project. Was Rob? Did Ursula feed on demand? That's, I think, the cause, the issues with Rob. That changed. Helen was a good mum to Henry. I know that's contentious, but for me, he had a great mum. He had consistency, sensitive observation, trust, and a great environment and freedom. These strong, effective ties will lead to lower levels of delinquency, hopefully. Henry will consider the feelings and views of Helen and his extended family before going on a rampage, and so less likely to become an axe-wielding maniac. And not only his family, Susan, by her own admission, is Central Intelligence Ambridge and will report back any misdemeanours. Ambridge is small enough for anything that Henry does to get back home will face consequences. And I grew up in a very small village where everybody found out exactly what I'd been up to. So, I honestly feel that Helen is a nurturer. I know we all criticise her for fobbing off the boys onto other people, but isn't that what busy working parents do? You find somebody that can pick up your child. But she does focus on the boys. She was really sensitive, I think, to Henry's needs. I lost count of the times that Helen had to wait for Henry to finish playing in the mud or watching the pigs. He had absolute uninterrupted time to play, which is important in building self-esteem and trust. Erikson's psychosocial stages give us a clue as to the potential outcomes for each stage of development. Trust is vital up to 18 months, and we know that Henry had that because Rob wasn't on the scene. Then to 3 years, autonomy is key. Henry, I would argue, did have autonomy. He did call the shots quite a lot of the time. The next stage is when Rob arrives. Henry was in the period where Ericsson's conflict is initiative versus shame and doubt. Did Rob tip the balance towards shame and doubt? If so, Henry might have been affected by Rob's values. He was exposed to Rob's criticism when playing cricket. I don't know if you'll remember those horrible scenes. And when poor Thomas the rabbit was binned. So thank you, Helena Bennett, if you're here, for reminding me of the name of Thomas the rabbit. Children acquire their beliefs and standards of behaviour from the people that are their role models. Are the effects of Rob's influence on Henry being seen in the aggression Henry's shown towards Kira in karate and in the naughtiness he's demonstrated at school? Henry may have avoidant attachment, so he might have issues with intimacy. He could have a vision of the perfect relationship, seeing any parallels with Rob here, and be hypercritical of partners and avoid attachment. So you can contrast this a little bit with some of the apron strings which haven't been cut in Bridge Farm. So we've still got Tom running back to Mum and Dad all the time, and Helen too. So if Henry had avoidant attachment due to trauma, he's more likely to become competitive and belligerent. And are we seeing this come out in the karate? The criticism of this view is that the quality of parental caregiving has a greater influence, especially with boys. So we've got the wholesomeness of the Archer clan there. But the impact of family strain is greater on boys than girls, and this, combined with the effects and exposure to the domestic violence and delinquency risk factors, makes Henry more vulnerable. However, I'd argue that the Walton-style wholesomeness of Bridge Farm cancels this out. The amount of time that Henry was influenced by Rob may be key in whether he descends into violent offending behaviour. Offending behaviour by the father can predict delinquent behaviour of the sons. This risk is heightened the longer the boy is with the asocial role model. I don't think Henry was with Rob long enough. I may be wrong. Have we seen any signs of these patterns of behaviour to date, apart from Henry being horrid to Kira? One of the warning signs is uncontrolled temper at the age of 3. Another is being callous between the ages of 7 and 12. So I think we need to be looking out for wasp factory style violence and cruelty in future episodes. Extensive periods of humiliation have been found to be present in the childhoods of several adult serial killers. Now, Henry was humiliated by Rob. This may have led Henry feeling powerless. Those who ended up as serial killers were unable to retaliate against those who had caused them humiliation and chose to harm animals instead. Henry began wetting the bed during this period, and Eric, the charity supporting parents and carers of children who have enuresis, wrote an article, "Why is Henry wetting the bed on the Archers?" It considers that Henry's bedwetting is linked to anxiety relating to changes and stresses in life. He'd just started school, his mummy's about to have another baby, and both parents are emotionally on edge. However, the author does acknowledge that domestic violence can be a trigger as it causes heightened levels of fear and anxiety. Now, some researchers link enuresis and future violence, associating the humiliation connected to bedwetting to finding a victim, torturing animals, and then fellow humans. What's going to happen to Kira? Further risks to Henry include his exposure to domestic violence and coercive control. And you can see in Rob's relationship with his father and the way that Bruce treats other people, controlling behaviour, criticism, disapproval. And Henry was at a vulnerable age for this when Rob started to get into his stride. How do I go back on this?
Just the other arrow backwards.
Sorry, that one. Yeah, okay, thank you. Parenting styles have got an influence on adult behaviour of children. The optimum style is authoritative, so a balance between maintaining boundaries but being flexible. Rob's style was authoritarian, very high in control, very little warmth. He was strict, little flexibility and punishment. In some cases, autonomy was forced, but punished in other cases. Henry was so scared of Rob at times that he did obey without question. Yes, Daddy. Sorry, Daddy. The legacy for Henry will be having low self-esteem. He could easily be led into potential criminal behaviours. He may have low self-worth and a passive interest in his own life. He could be unable to take responsibility for his own actions or be unable to take decisions. He'll go with the flow and be the kid that eats horse feed or mealworms to gain approval from his peers. He could be anxious about change and trying new things, which could lead to a cycle of doubt and self-esteem. He might have issues with his peers. He might not be able to make friends. We don't hear an awful lot about play dates at the moment with Henry. All we generally hear about is him being quite mean to Kira. I'm worried for Kira in the future. Is he going to be able to commit in relationships? Do we see any parallels between his mum and his uncle in that? So, in summary, yes, he'll become a violent bully. Parenting from Rob will have transmitted Rob's values. So he's seen how to become a bully from Rob. Boys more likely to develop avoidant attachment, and they'll become more competitive and aggressive. He's been exposed to domestic violence and other risk factors of delinquency, and he's more likely than a girl to reproduce the behaviours he's seen. There's been inconsistency in parenting styles, so that can cause emotional blunting. He's also likely to have low self-esteem and become a bully because of what he's seen. Role modelling. This does scare me. Who is Henry going to have as a role model? Tom, Businessman of the Year. Rob, the bully. But hopefully Johnny, lovely Johnny. Henry was in a key developmental stage for primary socialisation, and unfortunately his main influence was Rob. Not psycho. So, will he be as normal as an archer can be? The research states that he didn't need to be surgically attached to his mum to develop a secure attachment. So those years with her, or months with her banged up, hopefully shouldn't make a difference. His upbringing is not only down to his mum, but very much down to his grandparents, who have a very boring, consistent influence. Attachment can happen later in life. They were securely attached to start off with. And he went to his childminder. From what I remember, he went to his childminder without a fight. And these strong affective ties should give low levels of delinquency. He's not only being brought up in a loving extended family, he's being brought up by Ambridge. Whatever he does is going to get reported back. And then, although saying that, I was very disappointed with him kicking Johnny in the doodahs the other week, because I was expecting a bit more punishment than that. So that does kind of counter what I'm talking about. And also consistent primary socialisation for most of his life is really powerful for his moral compass. So that is Henry. What we need to look out for: casual bullying, lack of remorseful guilt. He didn't feel guilty about ruining Johnny's chances of becoming a dad. Superficially charming, having a short temper, intimidating smaller kids, and torturing small animals. So, there you go. That's whether he'll become a psychotic, axe-wielding maniac or just boring like the rest of his family.
Oh my gosh, there's a rush of hands there. I personally wonder whether there's a Chester D'Urberville story happening here, with Henry as the Alec D'Urberville, then Jack as the sort of Angel Clare of the land, and then maybe it's Kira who will see sacrificed at the top of Lakey Hill in this saga. Let's go to some questions. Oh, sorry, right at the back first.
Hello, I've been a family court judge for 25 years now, and everything you've said is totally accurate. And sadly, every day in my court, including yesterday, I see children suffering in the way that he's suffering. The only missing factor, of course, is the genetic effect of on psychology. We know his mother's genetic predispositions, and of course the missing factor, neither he nor anybody else knows what was the psychological makeup of his biological father.
It was Ian.
If only he'd be far more stable. And I'm currently trying to develop with CAFCAS a psychological service to children like this that we'll offer for free through the courts. Whether we'll succeed or not, I don't know. But you know, this sort of disturbed, and I'm going to say middle-class child, is the growth of those numbers is exponential. I just can't, you know, I've seen it throughout my career and getting worse by the year. And we really need to do something. Arches, in a way, is pointing it out, and particularly the effects of a domestic violence abuser. Thank you.
I remember when all of this happened with Rob and Henry and Helen, there was talk about counselling for both Helen and Henry, and it never happened because Pat very self-righteously, as far as I remember, said that it could all be dealt with within the family. She was so wrong. And I don't know why nobody insisted that Henry, at least, should have had some professional help following the ghastly circumstances which his son was in.
I think that's very much the middle class way of doing things, isn't it? Plus Pat can do anything. But this was discussed, I think, on last week's Dum Tee Tum, but really well. And yeah, he should be having some counselling. Helen definitely needs. She's going to be a single, sad old lady unless she gets some counselling. But there's hope.
I want to say thank you to the lady who's the family court, because what they do is amazing. But I also wanted to ask whether you think that Lee can balance out the fact that he's helping Henry to channel any energy through something a bit more positive with the karate. He seems to be enjoying it a lot, seems to be listening more than he ever does and saying more than okay. And I wondered what your thoughts were on maybe Lee could potentially bring up some balance.
I think Lee would be great because he's got the training. He's the physiotherapist, so he'll have some psychology, he'll have understanding about trauma. But obviously Helen shot herself in the foot with him, and, you know, will we see him again?
Hi, yeah, the social worker in me is curious about what went on between Rob and Henry that we don't necessarily know about, and whether or not that will come to light in the future and impact on how he is. I mean, I'm thinking particularly about sexual abuse, but clearly we don't know. But for me, it's an unanswered question.
So this is going to sound callous now, but did you uncover anything that would explain why Henry hasn't kept his toddler voice? Yeah.
That's a whole of the paper.
I've got a question, if that's right. You said that there was more of a tendency for boys than for girls to suffer this in some ways, and I wondered whether that was to do with socialisation and different expectations of different genders, or whether it was like a biological difference, if you know.
I didn't go that deeply into it. I imagine that it's a bit of both.
Yeah.
but also with boys and hormones and aggression, it's possibly linked to that. So when Henry gets to, how old is Henry? 8. So he'll be having some hormone release. So he should naturally start to get a bit more aggressive. But I'm just waiting for him to start torturing animals.
You mentioned lack of play dates and that sort of thing. And my concern has been quite some time now the fact that Helen seems unable to let Henry go anywhere except stay at home with Pat and Tony and Tom. And even when there's been the offer of him going to stay overnight with somebody or just to go and play, she's not accepted it at all. So it's her inability to let him go. Is it her lack of trust of him and what he's likely to do? Or is it her lack of self-esteem and the feeling that only she can look after him or the very close family? And I really worry about the long-term effect on him of not being able to go and make relationships with other children and other adult groups.
That's interesting, because then you've got Pip who will fob Rosie off onto passing strangers. So yeah.
I have a question. When do we think Rob's going to come back?
Do you think he's Tim in disguise?
Question over here. Oh, okay. Sorry, coming.
Thanks. I just wanted to add to what the lady said. We've actually concentrated on the sociological effects and behavioural effects of domestic abuse in the children. But I think in fact we need to address the increasing evidence of the physical effects. And we haven't actually looked at the potential for Henry to develop really quite severe psychological and mental health problems in his teenage years. And also there is some gathering evidence around the actual physical detrimental effects in adulthood and on chronic disease of childhood abuse. So I think we'd like to add that as well.
The Ambridge Fairy will cure that, because the Ambridge Fairy cured Daniel's juvenile arthritis. So don't worry.
Can I just ask you, in the next couple of years, do you think Henry will turn on Jack? Yes. Because you mentioned Kira, obviously, he's stuffed her under a bit.
That'd be quite fun, wouldn't it?
Yeah. And I just wonder where Helen will fit in that, because she's emotionally unravelling at the moment. She only needs one Monty cow to drop dead and she'll be gone.
They'll probably be adopted by Adam and Ian, and Helen will be carted off to an institution, and Adam and Ian will forget about what's-her-face in Hungary having their baby.
You heard it here first. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Show of hands. Show of hands, let's have the definitive. Is Henry going to turn out to be evil?
Yes!
How wonderful, I can't wait. So, from last year, one of our absolute brilliantly left field, oh my god, what the hell is this going to be like, oh my god, it's absolutely brilliant papers, was from James Armstrong from NATO, where he looked at, or he realised in his work in Kandahar, and then comparing that to Ambridge, there were all the factors there for the young men to rise up. James can't be here today. Working for NATO is not that easy for him just to get on a plane or a train and arrive in Sheffield. He was doing a podcast as a follow-up a year later, but using the characters, and it will be an absolute treat, it really will. And as soon as he can, he's going to send that to us and we'll put it online. It will be absolutely brilliant. But huge apologies from James for not being able to be here today. So we can break early now, finally. I'm back on my own schedule. We can break early and go down for teas and coffees, and we'll see you back here soon.
Do you want to